The Grand Hotel ballroom buzzed with the kind of energy that only academics could create. You know the type. Lots of expensive suits, confident handshakes, and conversations peppered with words most people would need a dictionary to understand. The annual International Economics Conference had drawn the best minds from universities across the globe, and everyone seemed eager to prove they belonged there. Professor Jonathan Mitchell stood near the refreshment table, a glass of wine in hand, surveying the room like a king observing his kingdom. At 47, he had earned his place among the elite. Harvard's youngest tenured economics professor in 2 decades, author of 3 best-selling books, and a regular commentator on major news networks. His salt and pepper hair and designer glasses gave him that distinguished look that opened doors and commanded respect. Jonathan, brilliant presentation last month on market dynamics, a colleague gushed as she walked past. He nodded graciously, though he'd heard similar praise so often it barely registered anymore. He had arrived in Boston 2 days early for this conference, specifically because he enjoyed these opening receptions. They were perfect hunting grounds, so to speak. He loved engaging in intellectual sparring matches, particularly with scholars who weren't quite at his level. Some called it arrogance. He called it maintaining standards. After all, if ideas couldn't withstand rigorous challenge, they didn't deserve a platform. His graduate assistant, a nervous young man named Timothy, approached with a stack of conference programs. "Professor, they've updated the speaker schedule. You're now on the Friday morning panel instead of Thursday afternoon." Jonathan frowned. "Who did they move to Thursday?" Timothy checked his notes. Someone named Margaret Chen. Says here she's speaking about grassroots economic development." "Never heard of her," Jonathan muttered, taking a program. He scanned the list of speakers, recognizing most names instantly. But Margaret Chen? The name was completely unfamiliar. No university affiliation listed, just independent economic consultant. He raised an eyebrow. Independent consultant was often code for someone who couldn't make it in academia. "Is she here?" Jonathan asked, more out of curiosity than genuine interest. Timothy glanced around the room. "I think that might be her." The older woman sitting by the window? Jonathan followed his gaze. In a corner of the ballroom, away from the clusters of animated conversation, sat an elderly woman who looked completely out of place. She appeared to be in her late 70s with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a plain navy cardigan over a modest dress, the kind of outfit someone's grandmother might wear to church, while everyone else was networking and socializing. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, watching the crowd with calm, observant eyes. "That's a speaker?" Jonathan couldn't hide his skepticism. "She looks like someone's grandmother who wandered into the wrong event." Timothy shifted uncomfortably. "The program says she's presenting tomorrow morning." Jonathan took another sip of wine, studying the woman with growing amusement. This conference was supposed to showcase cutting-edge economic research, and they'd given a speaking slot to someone who looked like she should be knitting booties, not discussing fiscal policy. He wondered if she was someone's relative, given a courtesy invitation and a brief speaking slot to be polite. As the evening wore on, Jonathan made his rounds, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with colleagues from Stanford, Oxford, and MIT. Every so often his gaze drifted back to the elderly woman. She remained in her corner, occasionally nodding politely when someone spoke to her but mostly staying quiet. She didn't network. She didn't try to insert herself into conversations. She just watched and listened. During dinner, Jonathan sat with a group of fellow professors and the conversation naturally turned to the conference schedule. Someone mentioned the grassroots development panel the next morning. "I might skip that one," said Professor Allen from Yale, cutting into his steak. "Grassroots work is fine for activists, but it's not exactly rigorous economic theory." "Agreed," Jonathan chimed in. "I saw the speaker list. Margaret Chen. Anyone know her work?" Heads shook around the table. No one recognized the name. "I think she's the older woman sitting alone over there," Jonathan said, gesturing discreetly with his fork. "Looks like someone's grandmother. Can't imagine what insights she could possibly offer that we haven't heard 1,000 times before." A few colleagues chuckled. One woman, Professor Linda Hayes from Columbia, looked less amused. "Maybe we should actually listen before judging," she said quietly. But her comment was drowned out by the conversation moving on to other topics. After dinner, the conference organizer, Dr. Patricia Foster took the stage to welcome everyone officially and preview the next day's events. When she mentioned Margaret Chen's morning session, she described it simply as a unique perspective on economic development from someone who spent decades working in the field. Decades working in the field, Jonathan thought. That probably meant she'd done some charity work in poor countries, felt inspired, and somehow talked her way onto the speaker list. He'd seen it before. Well-meaning people who confused compassion with expertise, who thought spending time with impoverished communities qualified them to speak about complex economic systems. As people began filtering out of the ballroom, heading back to their rooms or to the hotel bar for more networking, Jonathan noticed Margaret Chen standing near the coat check, waiting patiently while younger attendees pushed past her. She didn't seem bothered by being overlooked. In fact, she seemed almost content to be invisible. On impulse, Jonathan decided to introduce himself. Perhaps it was the wine, or perhaps he was already anticipating the entertainment value of tomorrow's session, but he approached her with his most charming smile. "Ms. Chen, I'm Professor Jonathan Mitchell from Harvard. I understand you're speaking tomorrow morning." She looked up at him with surprisingly bright, intelligent eyes. "Yes, that's right. And please call me Margaret." Her voice was soft but clear, with a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "I'm looking forward to your presentation," he lied smoothly. "Grassroots development is such an interesting topic. Tell me, what's your background? Where did you do your research?" "Oh, here and there," she said with a gentle smile. "I've spent most of my career working in small villages and rural communities. Not very glamorous compared to places like Harvard, I'm sure." Jonathan's smile widened. This was even better than he'd thought. She was humbled to the point of self-deprecation, probably intimidated by the academic heavyweights surrounding her. Tomorrow's Q&A session would be entertaining indeed. "Well, we can all learn from different perspectives," he said in the tone one might use with a child sharing their crayon drawing. "I'm sure you have some charming anecdotes to share." "I hope they'll be useful," Margaret replied, seeming to miss or ignore his condescension entirely. As Jonathan walked away, he felt a surge of anticipation. He'd already decided to attend her session tomorrow, not to learn, but to ask the kind of pointed, sophisticated question that would expose the limitations of her perspective. It wouldn't be cruel, exactly. Just educational. Someone needed to maintain academic standards, after all. He met up with a group of colleagues heading to the hotel bar and couldn't resist sharing. "I just spoke with tomorrow's grassroots speaker. Sweet old lady, completely out of her depth. I'll probably sit in on her session. Could be amusing. Going to show her how real economics is done?" one colleague joked. "Something like that," Jonathan replied, and they all laughed as they headed for drinks. Back in the now empty ballroom, a young conference volunteer helped Margaret with her coat. "Dr. Chen, can I help you find your room?" the volunteer asked. "No, thank you, dear. I remember the way," Margaret said kindly. As she walked toward the elevators, that same gentle smile played on her lips, and her eyes held something that might have been amusement. She'd been to hundreds of conferences over her long career. She'd met hundreds of Jonathan Mitchells. Tomorrow would be interesting indeed. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the conference hall, catching dust particles that danced in the light. Jonathan Mitchell arrived 15 minutes early, securing a front row seat. He wanted to be close enough to see every uncertain glance, every moment of hesitation when he posed his questions. His colleagues had laughed when he told them he was actually attending the grassroots development session, but he'd convinced 3 of them to join him for the entertainment. The room filled slowly. About 60 people trickled in, a decent crowd for a morning session, though Jonathan noticed most were younger academics and graduate students. The heavyweights had chosen other panels. Smart choice, he thought, except they'd missed the show. Margaret Chen entered from a side door, accompanied by Dr. Patricia Foster, the conference organizer. She still wore simple clothes, a brown skirt and cream blouse that probably came from a department store. No designer labels, no power suit, nothing that commanded attention. She carried a worn leather folder and seemed completely unbothered by the crowd or the setting. Patricia approached the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This morning, I'm pleased to introduce Margaret Chen, who will share insights from her extensive field experience in economic development across multiple continents. Margaret has worked directly with communities in Asia, Africa, and South America. implementing programs that have impacted millions of lives. Please welcome her. The applause was polite but not enthusiastic. Jonathan clapped slowly, a slight smirk on his face. Extensive field experience sounded impressive until you realized it was code for no prestigious academic credentials. Margaret stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone down to her height. She smiled warmly at the audience, not at all nervous despite being on stage in front of dozens of brilliant minds. "Good morning," she began, her voice gentle but carrying clearly through the room. "Thank you all for being here. I know there are many fascinating panels happening right now, so I appreciate you choosing to spend this hour with me." Already too humble, Jonathan thought. She's intimidated and trying to cover it with niceness. "I'm not going to bore you with complicated theories or fancy formulas this morning," Margaret continued. "Instead, I want to tell you about real people I've worked with and what I've learned from them about how economies actually work at the ground level." Jonathan exchanged glances with his colleague, Professor Allen, seated beside him. They both suppressed smiles. Not going to bore us with complicated theories was clearly her way of saying she didn't understand them. Margaret launched into her presentation, and to Jonathan's surprise, she was actually an engaging storyteller. She talked about a small village in rural Vietnam where she'd spent 3 years. She described how the women there had started a collective farming initiative, pooling their tiny resources to buy better seeds and share equipment. She explained how they'd increased their yields by 40% in just 2 years. "The interesting part," Margaret said, clicking to a simple slide with hand-drawn charts, "was that traditional lending models said these women were too risky to invest in. They had no collateral, no formal education, no credit history, but they had something economists often overlook: social capital and collective accountability." Jonathan shifted in his seat. It was a nice story, sure, but it was anecdotal. One village in Vietnam didn't prove anything about broader economic principles. This was exactly the problem with activists masquerading as economists. They confused heartwarming tales with data. Margaret continued with more stories. A community in Kenya that had created their own informal banking system. A group of farmers in Peru who had revolutionized their local economy by organizing a cooperative. Each story was told with warmth and specific details that made the people real and relatable. But to Jonathan, it all sounded like feel-good case studies that belonged in a charity newsletter, not at a serious academic conference. Where were the regression analyses? The economic models? The theoretical frameworks? This was Economics 101 material dressed up with emotional stories. About 30 minutes into the presentation, Margaret opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up immediately, mostly from the younger attendees who seemed genuinely interested in her stories. A graduate student asked about scaling challenges. Margaret answered thoughtfully, discussing the balance between maintaining community-led initiatives and expanding impact. Another asked about failure rates. Margaret admitted, quite honestly, that about 30% of the programs she'd worked with had failed, and she explained what she'd learned from those failures. Jonathan was getting bored. The questions were too soft, too friendly. Nobody was challenging her fundamental premise. Finally, he raised his hand. Margaret nodded toward him with that same gentle smile. "Yes, please, the gentleman in the front row." Jonathan stood up slowly, making sure everyone's attention was on him. He wanted the room to understand that a real scholar was about to speak. "Thank you for your charming stories," he began, his tone dripping with barely concealed condescension. "But I have to say, I'm struggling to understand how any of this constitutes serious economic theory." The room went quiet. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jonathan continued, warming to his theme. "You talk about small villages and informal cooperatives as if they're revolutionary. But these are just basic examples of collective action theory, which was thoroughly explored decades ago. You mention social capital, but you don't seem to engage with any of the actual literature on the subject. Bourdieu, Coleman, Putnam. You haven't presented any rigorous data analysis. No econometric models, no testing of hypotheses." He paused, looking at her with an expression of exaggerated patience, as if explaining something to someone who was trying hard, but simply didn't have the capacity to understand. "What you're describing isn't economics. It's sociology mixed with charity work. Now, I'm sure your heart is in the right place, and these little projects probably make people feel good. But," he slowed down his speech deliberately, emphasizing each word. This isn't how we understand economic development at institutions like Harvard. We deal with real theoretical frameworks, quantitative analysis, peer-reviewed research. He let that hang in the air for a moment. Several audience members looked embarrassed, though whether for Margaret or for Jonathan himself wasn't clear. So my question is this, Jonathan concluded, his voice taking on a professorial tone, as if lecturing a struggling undergraduate. Do you actually have any formal training in economics? And if not, what makes you think these folk tales and anecdotes qualify as economic insight worthy of presentation at a conference of this caliber? The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan remained standing, arms crossed, waiting for her to fumble through some inadequate response. He half expected her to become flustered, maybe even tear up. Some people simply couldn't handle rigorous academic challenge. But Margaret's expression didn't change. She looked at him calmly, that same slight smile still on her face. If anything, her eyes seemed to sparkle with something. Was it amusement? That's an interesting perspective, Professor Mitchell, she said evenly, her voice still gentle but somehow carrying more weight now. I appreciate you sharing your concerns. Jonathan felt a flicker of satisfaction. She knew his name. She'd probably looked up who the important people in the room were. Of course she'd be aware of his reputation. You raised several valid points about academic rigor and theoretical frameworks, Margaret continued. And you're absolutely right that stories alone don't constitute comprehensive economic analysis. See, Jonathan thought, she's already backing down, admitting she's out of her depth. However, Margaret said, and something in her tone made several people lean forward. I wonder if perhaps we might have a longer conversation about this after the session. I'd be very interested to hear more about your thoughts on the relationship between theoretical models and practical implementation, especially in contexts where traditional economic assumptions don't quite hold. It was a deflection, Jonathan realized, a polite way of avoiding the question because she had no real answer. She was probably hoping to escape the spotlight and end the session quickly. I think we have time for you to address it now, Jonathan pressed, still standing. It's a simple question, really. What are your actual credentials? Where did you study economics? Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and for just a second, Jonathan could have sworn he saw something knowing in her eyes, almost pitying. I studied economics at Cambridge, she said simply. A long time ago, but you're right that theories and models are important. I just happen to believe that the people living these economic realities also have something to teach us. Perhaps I'm old-fashioned that way. Cambridge? Jonathan felt a tiny prick of surprise, but he brushed it aside. Lots of people studied at Cambridge. That didn't mean she'd excelled or contributed anything meaningful to the field. And from the way she'd presented all stories, no substance, it was clear she'd either forgotten her training or never really understood it in the first place. Well, he said with a patronizing smile, I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree about what constitutes serious scholarship. Thank you for your time. He sat down, feeling vindicated. Around him, he could sense mixed reactions, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable. The younger academics especially seemed upset, but that was typical. Students today were too soft, too willing to value feelings over facts. Margaret handled a few more questions, gracious and patient with each person. When the session ended, several graduate students rushed to the front to speak with her, thanking her enthusiastically for her insights. Jonathan gathered his things, ready to leave. He'd made his point. As he headed toward the exit, he overheard two young professors talking behind him. That was brutal, one whispered. I know. Mitchell was really rude. Someone should tell him who she actually is. Jonathan slowed his pace, pretending to check his phone while straining to hear more, but the two had already moved past him. Jonathan stepped into the crowded hallway, feeling rather pleased with himself. The conference attendees flowed around him like water around a stone, heading to their next sessions. He checked his watch. 45 minutes until his own panel discussion. Plenty of time to grab coffee and maybe share the morning's entertainment with a few colleagues. He'd barely made it 10 feet when Professor Linda Hayes from Columbia appeared beside him, her expression difficult to read. Jonathan, do you have a minute? Eh? She asked quietly. Of course, he said, still riding the high of his intellectual victory. What did you think of that session? I tried to be diplomatic, but someone had to point out the obvious. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. You might want to look up Margaret Chen before you say anything else about her. Jonathan laughed. Linda, come on. I know you're big on being inclusive and supportive, but we can't just give everyone a platform because they have nice stories to tell. Standards matter. I'm serious, Jonathan. Her tone cut through his amusement. Go to the conference library or use your phone. Look her up properly, not just a quick glance at the program. Something in her voice made him pause. Linda wasn't usually this intense about anything. She was walking away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the middle of the hallway feeling suddenly uncertain. Timothy, his graduate assistant, appeared at his elbow holding 2 cups of coffee. Professor Mitchell, I got you a double espresso, just how you like it. Timothy, Jonathan said, taking the coffee absently, pull out your phone. Look up Margaret Chen, the woman who just spoke. Tell me what you find. Timothy's fingers flew across his screen while Jonathan sipped his coffee, trying to shake off the nagging feeling Linda had planted in his mind. It was probably nothing. Maybe Margaret had published a few papers decades ago. Enough to impress Linda, but nothing that would change his assessment of this morning's presentation. Okay. Found her Wikipedia page, Timothy said, squinting at his screen. Margaret Chen, born 1947 in Singapore. Educated at Cambridge University. Wait. His eyes widened. Professor, it says she got her PhD in economics from Cambridge in 1972. She was one of the first women to earn a doctorate in economics there. Jonathan felt a small twist in his stomach but maintained his composure. Okay, so she has a PhD. That doesn't change the fact that her presentation was light on actual theory. There's more, Timothy continued, scrolling rapidly. She was appointed as one of the first female advisors to the World Bank in 1975. She worked there for 15 years, specializing in poverty reduction strategies. The twist in Jonathan's stomach tightened. She published, oh my God, Professor. She published over 200 peer-reviewed papers in major economics journals. She's credited with pioneering microfinance theory in the 1980s. It says her work influenced Muhammad Yunus, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for microfinance. Jonathan's hand froze halfway to his mouth. Coffee cup suspended in air. Timothy kept reading, his voice growing more awed with each sentence. She was a visiting professor at Harvard from 1983 to 1986. She advised 3 different presidents of developing nations on economic policy. She won the Global Development Prize in 1998, the Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought in 2003, and was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Economics twice, in 2005 and 2009. The hallway suddenly felt too warm. Jonathan's collar seemed to tighten around his neck. She established the Chen Foundation for Economic Empowerment in 1995, which has distributed over $500 million in microloans to communities in 47 countries. She retired from public speaking and advisory work in 2010 to focus on direct community development. Professor, she's literally one of the most influential development economists of the last 50 years. Jonathan couldn't speak. The coffee in his hand had gone cold, but he didn't notice. His mind was racing backward through everything he'd said that morning. Every condescending word, every patronizing tone. Oh no, Timothy whispered, staring at his phone screen. Professor, someone recorded your question this morning. It's already circulating on the conference message boards. What? Jonathan's voice came out hoarse. Timothy turned his phone to show him. There it was, a video clip of Jonathan standing in the front row saying, "What you're describing isn't economics. It's sociology mixed with charity work." And then, mortifyingly, his voice slowing down as if speaking to a child. This isn't how we understand economic development at institutions like Harvard. The comments below the video were scathing. Did Mitchell really just try to lecture Margaret Chen on economics? That's like explaining gravity to Einstein. The arrogance is stunning. He clearly had no idea who he was talking to. This is why nobody likes Harvard professors. Jonathan's face burned. Around him, the hallway seemed to spin slightly. Several passing academics glanced at him, and he wondered if they'd already seen the video, if they were already judging him. Professor, are you okay? Timothy asked nervously. You look pale. Jonathan started, then stopped. What did he need? To disappear? To go back in time and keep his mouth shut? I need to go to the library. Now. He walked quickly, Timothy scurrying to keep up, his mind reeling with each step. The conference library was a quiet room on the second floor, set up with computers and research materials for attendees. Jonathan claimed a computer in the corner away from prying eyes and began searching. The more he read, the worse he felt. Margaret Chen wasn't just respected, she was legendary in development economic circles. Her 1984 paper, Social Capital as Economic Currency, was one of the most cited works in the field, with over 15,000 citations. Her book, Economics from the Ground Up, was required reading in development courses at universities worldwide. But she'd retired from the academic spotlight 15 years ago, which explained why younger scholars like himself might not immediately recognize her name. She'd deliberately stepped away from conferences and publications to do direct field work. She'd chosen implementation over theory, practice over prestige, and he'd dismissed it all as folktales and anecdotes. Jonathan clicked on a video interview from 2008, before her retirement. The interviewer, a fellow economist, asked her about the relationship between theoretical models and practical application. "Theory without practice is sterile," Margaret said in the video, her voice clear and confident. "But practice without theory is aimless. The real magic happens when we let them inform each other, when we build models based on what actually works for real people, and then use those models to improve our practice. Too often, we economists fall in love with our elegant equations and forget that behind every data point is a human life." Jonathan closed the video. "He felt physically sick, Professor Mitchell." A voice behind him made him jump. He turned to find Dr. Patricia Foster, the conference organizer, standing there with a concerned expression. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" His throat went dry. "Of course." Patricia sat down in the chair beside him, her voice low but firm. "I've been getting messages about the incident in this morning's session. I wanted to give you some context before things get more complicated." "I've been reading about Dr. Chen," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. She specifically requested that we not include her full credentials in the program," Patricia explained. "She said she wanted people to engage with her ideas based on merit, not on her reputation. She's always been like that, more interested in substance than status." Jonathan wanted to crawl under the desk and disappear. "Between you and me," Patricia continued, "Margaret has been one of my mentors for 20 years. She was my dissertation advisor when I was at Yale. She's the reason I got into this field, and she's the kindest, most brilliant person I've ever known." Each word landed like a stone on Jonathan's chest. "She called me about 20 minutes ago," Patricia said, and Jonathan's heart stopped. "She asked me to make sure you're okay. She was worried that you might be feeling embarrassed and wanted me to check on you." Jonathan actually laughed, a bitter, disbelieving sound. "She's worried about me? After what I said to her?" "That's Margaret," Patricia said with a sad smile. "She doesn't hold grudges. She's seen enough real hardship in her life to not sweat the small stuff." "But Jonathan," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "This is making waves. People are talking. You might want to consider addressing it somehow." After Patricia left, Jonathan sat alone in the library for nearly an hour, reading everything he could find about Margaret Chen's work. He read her papers on microfinance, her case studies on community-led development, her theoretical frameworks that elegantly bridge the gap between macro policy and micro implementation. It was all there, everything he'd accused her of lacking. The rigorous analysis, the econometric models, the hypothesis testing, she'd done it all. Decades ago, publishing in the most prestigious journals. And then she'd taken that theory and used it to actually help millions of people. The stories she'd shared that morning, the Vietnamese farmers, the Kenyan banking system, the Peruvian cooperative, weren't just feel-good anecdotes. They were case studies from programs she'd designed and implemented using sophisticated economic theory. She'd simplified her presentation for accessibility, assuming the audience would be familiar with the underlying frameworks. Everyone except him, apparently. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, some colleagues offering awkward support, others maintaining conspicuous silence. The video had spread beyond the conference now, shared on academic social media, dissected in economics forums. Someone had created a meme, a picture of Margaret Chen with the cap T. And when someone tries to explain your own theories to you, below it, comments from economists around the world. "I studied under Dr. Chen at the World Bank. She's..." Forgotten more about economics than most of us will ever. No. Imagine having the audacity to condescend to Margaret Chen. The second hand, embarrassment is real. This is a masterclass in why arrogance and ignorance are such a dangerous combination. Jonathan's panel was in 15 minutes, but he couldn't imagine facing a room full of people right now. Everyone would have seen the video. Everyone would know what an arrogant fool he'd been. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Professor Mitchell. The voice was soft, familiar. This is Margaret Chen. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Jonathan's hand trembled as he held the phone to his ear. Of all the people he expected to call him right now, Margaret Chen was the absolute last. Dr. Chen, he managed, his voice cracking slightly. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, she replied gently. I'm calling because I was hoping we could talk if you have time. I'm in the conference library, actually, in the small reading room at the back. Would you join me? She was here. In the library. Jonathan looked around wildly, suddenly aware of how disheveled he must look. Having spent the past hour slumped over a computer, reading about his own spectacular failure and judgment. I'm actually in the library too, he said. I'll be right there. He found her in the reading room, a quiet corner space with comfortable chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. She was reading a book, looking perfectly serene, as if nothing unusual had happened that morning. When she saw him, she smiled and gestured to the chair across from her. Thank you for coming. Please sit down. Jonathan sat feeling like a student called to the principal's office. His carefully constructed professional confidence had completely evaporated. He was just a man who'd made a terrible mistake facing the person he'd wronged. Dr. Chen, I need to apologize, he began, the words tumbling out. What I said this morning was inexcusable. I was condescending and dismissive and arrogant, and I had absolutely no idea who you were or what you've accomplished. I've spent the last hour reading about your work and I'm mortified. There's no excuse for how I behaved. Margaret listened patiently, her hands folded in her lap, her expression kind rather than angry. I appreciate your apology, she said when he finished, but I want you to understand something. I'm not offended by what you said. Jonathan blinked, confused. You're not? No. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes warm but serious. I'm concerned, though. Not for me, but for you. For me. Professor Mitchell, may I ask you something? When you stood up this morning to challenge me, what were you hoping to accomplish? The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, really thinking about it for the first time. I suppose. He started slowly. I wanted to demonstrate rigorous academic standards, to show that we can't just accept stories as scholarship. But was that really all? Margaret asked gently. Or were you also trying to prove something? Perhaps to yourself or to the other people in that room. Jonathan felt his face flush. She was right, of course. He'd wanted to be the smartest person in the room, to remind everyone of his status, his intelligence, his importance. I've met many people like you over the years, Margaret continued, her tone never judgmental, just honest. Brilliant minds, impressive credentials, genuine expertise. But somewhere along the way, they started believing that being smart meant making others feel small. Her words struck something deep inside him. Jonathan had always told himself that he was maintaining standards, pushing for excellence, refusing to accept mediocrity. But was that what he'd really been doing? Or had he been using his intelligence as a weapon, his credentials as armor? When I was younger, Margaret said, settling back in her chair, I was a lot like you, actually. Maybe worse. I was the only woman in most of my classes at Cambridge in the early 1970s. Do you know what that was like? Jonathan shook his head, genuinely curious now. Every day I had to prove I deserved to be there. Every comment I made in class was scrutinized. Every paper I wrote was held to a higher standard. I learned to be sharp, quick, always ready with a devastating counter-argument. I learned to tear down other people's ideas before they could tear down mine. She paused, looking out the window at the city below. I was brilliant, but I was also insufferable. I thought that being the smartest person in the room was the same thing as being the best person in the room. I confused intelligence with wisdom, credentials with character. What changed? Jonathan asked quietly. I went to Bangladesh in 1976, Margaret said. I was 29 years old with a PhD from Cambridge and a prestigious job at the World Bank. I went to evaluate a small lending program in a rural village. I had all these sophisticated economic models in my head, all this theory about how development should work. She smiled at the memory. The women in that village couldn't read. They'd never been to school. According to every model I'd learned, they were high-risk borrowers who couldn't possibly manage capital effectively. But I watched them for 3 months, and do you know what I discovered? They understood economics better than most of my colleagues with PhDs. How so? Jonathan leaned forward, genuinely interested. They understood risk pooling, collective accountability, seasonal cash flow management, and market timing. They didn't use the fancy terms, but they lived the concepts every single day. They had to. Their family's survival depended on it. Margaret's voice grew more animated as she spoke. There was one woman, I'll never forget her. Her name was Amina. She'd never spent a day in school, but she could calculate compound interest in her head faster than I could with a calculator. She understood market dynamics, supply and demand, the relationship between investment and return. She just expressed it differently. What did she teach you? Jonathan asked. That intelligence comes in many forms. That lived experience is as valuable as theoretical knowledge. That the people we're trying to help with our economic policies aren't just data points. They're experts in their own lives. Most importantly, she taught me that my job wasn't to show everyone how smart I was. It was to learn from everyone I could, to stay humble, and to use my privileges and opportunities to amplify voices that weren't being heard. Jonathan felt something shifting inside him, a fundamental reassessment of beliefs he'd held for years. I made a mistake similar to yours once, Margaret continued. I was at a conference in Geneva in 1982. A man presented a paper about informal economies in African markets. He was from Tanzania, a local government official who'd done field research. His English wasn't perfect, his presentation style was simple, and his slides were hand-drawn. She shook her head at the memory. I eviscerated him during the Q&A. I pointed out all the ways his research methodology was flawed, how his conclusions didn't align with established theory, how his data collection was unsystematic. I was technically correct about all of it, but I was also cruel and dismissive. What happened? After the session, another economist, an older gentleman from India, pulled me aside. He said, Dr. Chen, you are very smart. Everyone knows this. But your intelligence is worth nothing if you use it to hurt rather than help. That man came here at great personal expense, hoping to share what he'd learned so that his country's informal economy might be better understood and supported. You didn't engage with his ideas. You destroyed his confidence. Margaret's eyes were distant, reliving the moment. I felt exactly how you're feeling right now. Ashamed, embarrassed, defensive. I wanted to argue that I was just maintaining academic standards, but I knew the truth. I'd been showing off, proving my superiority, and I'd done it at someone else's expense. Did you apologize to him? I tried, Margaret said sadly, but he'd already left the conference. He flew home that night. I later learned that he never presented his research again. That paper, which actually contained some valuable insights about economic resilience in informal markets, was never published. The knowledge he'd gained was lost because I'd made him feel that his work wasn't valuable. The weight of that story settled over both of them. I carry that with me, Margaret said. Every time I speak, every time I engage with someone's ideas, I remember that man's face. I remember how my words had the power to either encourage or destroy, and I choose every single day to use my knowledge to build up rather than tear down. Jonathan sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she'd said. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, probably colleagues texting about his panel, which he'd completely missed by now. He didn't care. How do you do it? He finally asked. How do you stay humble when you've achieved so much? You've won international prizes, influenced policy for entire nations, helped millions of people. You could walk into any room and demand recognition. But you don't, Margaret smiled. Because I learned something important. Recognition isn't the goal. Impact is the goal, and impact requires collaboration, not domination. It requires listening, not just speaking. It requires being willing to learn from everyone, especially from people the world tells us aren't worth listening to. She stood up, walking to the window. The farmers in Vietnam who I talked about this morning, they taught me about climate adaptation strategies that my models hadn't predicted. The women in Kenya revolutionized my understanding of trust economics. The cooperative in Peru showed me innovative approaches to wealth distribution that challenged standard theory. She turned back to face him. I don't hide my credentials because I'm modest, Professor Mitchell. I hide them because I want people to engage with my ideas based on merit, not authority. I want to learn from them, and they can't teach me if they're too intimidated to speak. The moment I walk into a room announcing all my achievements, I create a hierarchy that stifles the very exchange of ideas that I need. Jonathan stood as well, feeling something fundamental shifting in his understanding of himself and his profession. I've been doing this all wrong, haven't I? He said quietly. Not just this morning. For years. Margaret walked over to him, looking up at him with those kind, wise eyes. You have a brilliant mind, she said. Your research on market dynamics is genuinely impressive. Yes, I've read your work. You have so much to offer the field. But brilliance without kindness creates knowledge that sits in journals unread and unused. Brilliance with humility creates knowledge that changes the world. She patted his arm gently, like a grandmother comforting a struggling grandchild. The question isn't whether you made a mistake today. We all make mistakes. The question is what you'll do with this experience. Will you let it teach you? Will you let it change you? Or will you just add it to your list of embarrassments and move on unchanged? Jonathan knew the answer. He could feel it crystallizing inside him, a resolution forming. I want to learn, he said. I want to change. But I don't know where to start.